But a global recession is highly unusual, and that appears to be what we're heading for. So my forecast, I do update them, but big picture, it goes as follows. So what is Jay Powell doing? First of all, March 1st, 2022, the Fed fund policy rate, interest rates were zero. And we're now at 4.5%. Even in the Volcker days, we never went up 4.5% in 10 months. Not that fast. And so here we are. So what is Powell doing? Well, he's given 5 speeches on the subject. I don't know why Wall Street doesn't listen, but he keeps trying. He said the same thing every time. He said, inflation is job one. We're just going after inflation. Believe us. There is going to be a recession. Unemployment is going to go up. There's going to be pain. I've never heard a Fed chairman use the word pain. He used it 5 times in one paragraph in the Jackson Hole speech. And that's what we're doing. And believe us when we say it.
According to Jim Rickards, a global recession is coming and it's going to be painful. Unemployment will go up, the economy is slowing down, and the Federal Reserve has already used every single tool that they have. Inflation has come down, but for a really bad reason. We will get into the reason later in the video. There's the myth of something called the terminal rate. Simply put, it's a rate that the Federal Reserve needs to reach so that inflation will come down on its own without further rate hikes. Wall Street said the Fed is already at the terminal rate, so they don't need to raise it anymore, but the Fed is saying, no, we haven't reached the terminal rate yet, so we have to keep raising it until we reach the 2% inflation target. So the question is, how long will the Fed keep raising the interest rates? We're already over 5% now, and the Fed's still planning to raise it even more? With the current high interest rate, these tech companies already laying off a lot of their employees because they have to tighten their finances. What if the Fed raises it even more? Let's find out.
Now, how long will he raise rates? How quickly? And what's he trying to do? Powell is trying to get to something that he calls the terminal rate. The definition of the terminal rate is it's a rate that's high enough to cause inflation to come down on its own without further hikes. So we'll get to a level, and then inflation is coming down, by the way. And in the last 5 months, it's gone from, in the U.S., it's gone from about 9% to 8.7, 8.2, 7.4, 7.1. So it is coming down. Having said that, the target is 2%, and 7.1 is still a far cry from 2. So he's not there, but he's making progress. So here's I hate to use the word conundrum, but it kind of is. Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates, or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are 2 different things. Right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation is coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid-2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think. And rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it. And you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message, why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake.
Jim Rickards said something about the Volcker mistake and why Jerome Powell is still raising the interest rate and not cutting it yet. The famous Fed pivot, as Wall Street calls it. Jay Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake by cutting the interest rates too early and failing to bring inflation down. Do you know why the interest rate was raised to 20% back in the 1980s? It's because of the Volcker mistake. The tale goes as follows: in the late 1970s, inflation was going up a lot and therefore the interest rates rose from around 4.5% to 10%. But that 5% raise took 3 years, from 1976 to 1979. Meanwhile, the current rate hike that we have now is the fastest in history. We went from 0 to 5.25% in just 1 year. Back in the 80s, we had a recession, and the chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, had to cut the interest rate down by 7%. Not 0.7%, but 7 full percentage points. He cut the interest rate from 17% to around 10%. And after that pivot, he raised it back to 20%, and 3 years later in 1987 the rates finally came back to normal. Back then, we needed 10 years in order to finally win the inflation fight. And now what? We're expecting it to win in a couple of months? The Fed just raised the rates fastest in history and people expect to bring it back down? Let's get into the detail.
People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, and he said this in his last book just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist. He's a lawyer. So he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out?
We learned a lot from Jim about the current situation and what Jerome Powell will be doing. But there's more to that story. Powell doesn't even understand what's going on in the real world, which is inflation itself. There are two sources of inflation, the supply side and the demand side. We are at the supply side inflation, which means the supply of goods is scarce but the demand is high and therefore the prices go up. But supply side inflation can transform into demand side inflation, and this is where the dangers begin. People's spending behavior changes and they're worried that something worse will happen, and then they grab everything they can, and therefore the demand rises, and you got yourself inflation caused by an increase in the demand side. That's what most people don't understand, including Wall Street. Wall Street said inflation will come down on its own because we've reached the terminal rate. But Jerome Powell thinks we are not done yet and therefore he will raise rates even more. And what does Jim Rickards think? Does he think Powell is at the terminal rate yet?
In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, don't. If you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them: the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war, when they cut us off from oil, and you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing, and that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up, and people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed, and energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up, and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically, consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today, because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward, and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons.